What if the only man brave enough to show mercy was the one everyone feared? And what if the woman cast out by her people was the only one who knew how to save a life? This isn't just a story of survival in the wild. It's about healing in a world that punishes compassion. Stay with us, because what happens in that snow-covered cabin will shake everything you believe about justice, love, and what it means to be truly seen. The train shrieked as it screeched into Gardner, Montana, cutting through the winter silence like a rusty blade through brittle bone. Steam hissed from the engine and vanished into a thick curtain of snowflakes that refused to fall. They hovered suspended in a cold that didn't just chill skin but threatened to freeze the soul itself. Gardner was a hard place, worn and quiet, the kind of town where time didn't stop, it simply forgot to move. Elijah Braxton stepped down from the final coach with the weight of 7 years heavy on his shoulders. He wore it like he wore his coat, long, threadbare, weather-beaten at the cuffs. One side of the collar had been chewed by wind, and time the other was marked with soot. His boots hit the wooden planks of the platform with a solid thump. Not loud, but definite. No one looked up. He was fine with that. He hadn't come back for reunions. Elijah hadn't seen Gardner since the day he buried June. He left with nothing but a hoarse bottle and a scream locked tight in his throat. The road hadn't healed him. It had only dulled the pain to a kind of humming ache that filled every silence. The war had taught him how to kill. Grief had taught him how to forget. But Yellowstone had taught him what it meant to remember. The wind bit into his face as if to welcome him back with teeth. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney of the old depot, but inside all was still. Even the few men loitering by the baggage shed moved like ghosts, their eyes buried beneath hat brims, hands tucked deep in coat pockets. Elijah walked through them like a man through fog, seen but not touched. His grip tightened on the crate of dry goods he'd hauled from the train. A pickaxe and a length of frayed rope hung from one shoulder. Practical tools, but their purpose vague, like everything else these days. Then he felt it. Stillness, not the kind that came from peace, the kind that felt like something holding its breath. Watching, he turned, and there she was. Half hidden beneath a tarp between two freight crates lay a woman. Her body was curled against the station wall. Her wool shawl had frozen into stiff shapes, and her leggings were torn at the knees. One hand pressed to her upper thigh, fingers slick with blood turned tar dark. The other lay palm down in the snow, twitching. Elijah dropped the crate without a sound. He knelt, eyes narrowing as he scanned the damage. Her face was young, too young to be this bruised by the world. Her lips were cracked, her breath faint, but her eyes, when they opened those, were fierce, dark, unyielding. The look of someone who knew she wasn't welcome and had long stopped asking to be. A voice called out behind him. "Found her this morning," muttered Grady the railman, scratching his chin with gloved fingers. "Heard she's Apache. Might have come down from the ridgeline. Folks say she stole from some rancher. Don't think she belongs here." Elijah didn't reply. He just reached out and touched her cheek. It was like pressing his hand to stone. Something in him cracked. He thought of June, of her final hours, of the way her hand had gone slack in his. He thought of the silence after the kind that echoed louder than cannon fire. He stood then, bent again, and scooped the woman into his arms. She was light, frighteningly so. Yet even now, half conscious and half frozen, she felt present, real, more alive than he had in years. "She's someone not dying today," he said, and he turned. Grady shouted something after him, about the sheriff, about the town, about how it would be a mistake. But Elijah had already vanished into the falling snow. The trail to his old cabin had grown over with silence. The trees bowed heavy with snow, creaking like old bones. His horse, tethered near the tree line, neighed softly when he returned. Elijah tied the crate behind the saddle and carried her the rest of the way. The cabin was as he left it, half buried in drift door, hanging crooked on its hinges. He kicked it open and stepped into memory. Everything was as it had been. The bed still held the impression of June's last sleep, the hearth cold ash-gray and waiting. He laid the woman down, then stoked the fire with trembling hands. He worked in silence. Snow melted in a kettle. Old cloth boiled. He found a tin of willow bark and ground it to dust. He cleaned her wound, stitched it with the same thread he'd once used to mend a saddlebag. She didn't cry out. Her jaw stayed clenched, but her hand gripped the edge of the mattress. She was still fighting. When he was done, he placed a tin cup of water beside her and a slice of bread. Then he pulled the old rocking chair to the hearth and sat. The flames grew slowly like trust. Outside, the storm grew teeth. It howled against the roof, rattled the windows. But inside the cabin, the only sound was breath, hers, shallow but present, and his deeper now, like something had released its grip on his chest. Hours passed. Then a voice barely more than air. "You should have left me. I've left too many." She turned her head. Their eyes met. No shields, no pity. "Liana," she said. "Elijah," that was all. No explanations, no questions. Just names exchanged like offerings in the flicker of firelight. But in that moment, something broke through the frost. Not warmth, not yet, but the memory of it. And that Elijah thought was enough to start again. The morning after the storm rose like a ghost, soft, quiet, and unsure if it should stay. Light filtered through the cabin's slanted shutters, casting long beams across the floor like fingers gently waking the dead. Elijah stirred the coals with a stick of pine and watched them flicker back to life. The air still smelled of blood and smoke, but the woman Liana still breathed. That alone made it a better morning than most. She hadn't moved much during the night. Her face, pale and sharp in the firelight, looked carved from marble. The gash in her thigh had stopped bleeding, but the wound was deep and angry, stitched with a saddle needle and sheer will. Her skin burned with fever, and her breath came in short, shallow bursts. But she was alive. And that was a complication Elijah hadn't prepared for. He'd spent years alone, speaking only to the wind, the wood, and his own regrets. Now there was another heartbeat in the room, and it unsettled him. He went about his chores, mechanically melting snow for water, grinding bark for tea, folding the worn linens he hadn't touched in years. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots felt louder. Every breath from the bed behind him a reminder that silence could be broken. Mid-morning, she opened her eyes. He didn't notice until her voice, thin and dry, broke the hush. "You missed a spot," she rasped. He turned, startled. Her gaze was steady despite the pain etched on her brow. "The hearth," she whispered. "Corners still full of ash." Elijah found himself smiling just a little. "I'll get to it," he said, and something in the air shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. For the next 2 days they lived around each other like two wild animals circling the same fire. Liana spoke little, and Elijah spoke even less. But something about her presence stirred the ashes of who he had once been. He caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, and each time their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Curiosity, pain, survival. She began to regain strength slowly. By the second day, she shifted in bed, propping herself up with one elbow, her breath more even. Elijah adjusted the firewood and left a cup of water beside her. She took it without a word. That evening, he brought in wild carrots and a bundle of dry sage. She watched him clean and cut them at the table. "You know how to cook?" she asked. He grunted. I know how to keep things from killing me. She smirked. That counts. On the third morning, she reached for the cup of bark tea he left on the table. Her hand trembled, and the cup clattered to the floor. Elijah moved quickly, scooping it up. Try again, he said, offering it to her. She looked at him, then at her shaking hand, and then back at him. Slowly, she took it. Her fingers brushed his. Why, she asked. Because breathing shouldn't be the thing that gets you killed. That evening, as twilight painted the snow lavender and blue, Elijah returned from chopping wood to the sound of humming. It was low rhythmic, almost a whisper. He paused at the door. Inside, Liana lay propped on the bed, her voice weaving through the shadows. When he entered, she stopped. Don't, he said gently. It reminded me of something I forgot I knew. She nodded, then turned her gaze back to the ceiling. My mother sang it when she mended wounds, said, "Pain listens when you give it music." That night, Elijah carved. His fingers remembered the rhythm, even if his heart had forgotten the purpose. He shaped a small cane from pine, rough but sturdy. When he was done, he set it beside the bed and sat down again by the fire. In the quiet that followed, Liana whispered, "You don't ask questions. Folks ask when they want to change the answer." She let out a faint laugh, then winced. "Don't make me laugh. Hurts." "Then don't say funny things," he replied. Her fever returned that night. Elijah stayed up changing cloths, feeding her bitter teas, and whispering words he didn't know he remembered. She murmured, in a language he didn't understand, dreams or prayers or both. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. By morning, the fever broke, and something else did too. Trust isn't born from kindness. It's forged in the fires of helplessness and held in the spaces where words fail. As Elijah helped her sit upright and sip the last of the tea, she didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it clearly, "I'm still here because of you. And you didn't ask me why." The next afternoon, she managed to swing her legs off the bed. Elijah helped her to the chair by the window, wrapping her in a quilt that still held the scent of cedar. They sat in silence for almost an hour, watching the snow melt in rivulets down the panes. "I don't remember the last time I was this still," she murmured. "Stillness makes things loud," Elijah said. "Memories, regrets, everything you try not to carry." "Maybe," she said, "but sometimes it also reminds you you're still here." Outside, the snow began to melt at the edges. Inside, the fire burned a little brighter. And for the first time in years, Elijah didn't feel alone. They hadn't spoken of the past, of why she was hunted or why he'd walked away from the world. It didn't matter yet. Not in this quiet, not in this moment where survival had shifted into something slower, something sacred. Each day after that, she healed. He cooked, she cleaned, he carved. Their words remained few, but their silence spoke volumes. And in the hush between firelight and frost, something old and gentle stirred a memory of peace, or perhaps the beginning of it. In small towns like Gardner, Montana, it wasn't the weather that wore a person down, it was the watching. Not direct, not even obvious. Just the quiet way a curtain stirred in a window, or how a conversation died the moment you stepped into the room. Elijah knew it well. The town's silence didn't mean it had forgotten you. It meant it remembered everything. So when the whispers began, he wasn't surprised. It started at the general store. Grady, the railman, said her name with a grimace he tried to hide. "That Apache woman," he muttered, as if it were a fact carved in stone. "Still up there with Braxton. Can't be right, ain't safe. Not after what folks say, what folks said never needed proof." In Gardner, rumor wore the face of truth if enough people nodded. Elijah had expected as much. He wasn't naive, but he hadn't expected how quickly the words would spread. By the week's end, he could feel them gathering eyes that didn't meet his doors, that didn't open when he passed. Even the pastor who once offered him grace and a glass of whiskey now tightened his jaw when they met. Sheriff Monroe showed up that Friday, his boots loud on Elijah's porch. He didn't knock, just stood there waiting. Elijah opened the door and said nothing. "You know what they're saying," Monroe began. "Doesn't matter if it's true. It matters what folks believe. She don't belong." Elijah didn't move. "She hasn't harmed a soul," still, the sheriff said. "Trouble follows what folks don't understand." "She's not trouble," Elijah replied. "She's a person." Monroe exhaled slowly, not angry, just weary. "You're not the only one carrying grief, Braxton. Don't turn yours into something the town can't forgive." Elijah stepped back and shut the door. That was his answer. Inside, Liana stirred the soup. She hadn't asked what the sheriff wanted. She didn't need to, but the town wasn't all closed doors. A few days later, a young boy appeared at their cabin, barefoot, cheeks red from the cold. His name was Finn. He was the son of a local dairy farmer. He had a rash across both arms, angry and blistered. His mother had sent him to Elijah out of desperation. The woman, she said, the one who knows herbs. Liana knelt beside the boy, her fingers gentle as breath. She ground leaves, mixed them with snow and bark, and wrapped his arms in linen. When he returned, 3 days later, the rash was gone. Word spread not as a whisper, but as a story. The boy's father, a quiet man named Hal, dropped off a bundle of wood the next morning. Said nothing. Just left it stacked by the door. Then came the midwife, Mrs. Halbert, her hands shaking with age and arthritis. She brought Liana a tin of honey and a half-used book of home remedies. "Figured you'd do more good with it than I ever did," she said. Change didn't happen loud in Gardner. It came in waves, hesitant, soft, but real. Liana didn't smile often, but when she did, it wasn't something small. It felt like sunlight breaking through a window that hadn't been opened in years. One evening, Elijah found her humming again while she folded clean linens. It was the same song she'd sung in the fever. He didn't interrupt. Later that night, she sat across from him at the table as they shared a bowl of stew. He handed her a small carving, a bird, not perfect, but clearly made with care. She turned it in her fingers. "You made this?" He nodded. "From the pine behind the cabin." "It's ugly," she said. He laughed. "So's the stew." She laughed too, and for a moment the heaviness lifted. But outside, the town still watched. Grady talked louder now, like volume made things more true. "She don't belong," he said to anyone who'd listen. "She's from war, from pain. Nothing good comes of letting that kind stay." Yet each time Elijah walked into town, he carried not defiance, but calm. He nodded. He tipped his hat. He showed no anger, no fear. And that silence, his refusal to argue, did something more than words ever could. It made people wonder if maybe they'd been wrong. One morning, as Liana swept the cabin floor, she paused and looked at the doorway. "I could leave," she said. "You wouldn't owe me anything." Elijah looked up from sharpening his knife. "You're not a debt, but I'm a weight." He stood, walked to the door, opened it. The wind blew in, cold, clean. "Stay as long as you want," he said. The door's only meant to open one way. Outside, the frost clung to the trees. But inside, for the first time, it felt like spring might find its way in after all. The scream came like thunder beneath a quiet sky, a high cracking sound that didn't belong to the forest. Elijah Braxton was out back splitting kindling when he heard it. For a moment, he didn't move. He just listened. Sometimes the wind played tricks in these woods, echoing things that weren't there. But then it came again. A boy's voice close, urgent, real. "Help, please, somebody help." Elijah dropped the axe and moved. His legs, stiff from the cold, found speed as he turned the corner. A boy, no older than 10, stumbled into the clearing in front of the cabin. His coat was torn, face streaked with mud and panic. "They took her," he gasped, pointing back toward the ridge. "My sister." Men with a wagon said they'd sell her, please. Liana was already at the door. She'd heard it too. Her shawl was around her shoulders before he could speak. Elijah grabbed his shotgun from inside the cabin, checked the chamber, and threw the boy up behind him on the horse. Liana swung into the saddle without hesitation. They didn't ask names. They didn't need to. There was no time. The forest blurred around them as hooves pounded frozen earth. The boy shouted directions, his voice cracking with every word. They passed the old riverbed ducked beneath low branches, snow brushing their faces. Elijah didn't slow. The air grew sharper. The sun dipped lower. The silence between the boy's desperate words stretched tight like wire. Then they saw smoke. In a clearing ahead, a wagon sat cocked to one side. Its canvas top flapped in the wind. 3 men circled a fire. One leaned lazily against the wagon. Another stood near the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand. The third disappeared behind the canvas, where a young voice screamed again, ragged and terrified. Elijah dismounted before the horse stopped. He moved like water fluid and fast. The shotgun rose. "Let her go." The man near the wagon spun. His rifle lifted. Elijah fired. The shot echoed through the pines. The man dropped without a sound. The second man ran, not far, not fast. He tripped on a root and disappeared into the woods like smoke vanishing. The third burst from the back of the wagon, dragging a girl by the wrist. She was small, maybe 8 eyes wide with terror. He wrapped an arm around her throat, yelling threats that Elijah couldn't hear or wouldn't. Liana was already moving. She took Elijah's rifle as he knelt to cover the boy. Calmly, silently, she lifted it to her shoulder. One breath, one shot. The man fell. The girl stumbled forward into Liana's arms, sobbing. Her dress was torn, one boot missing. Liana wrapped her in the shawl she had worn all winter, the same shawl she had nearly died in. Elijah looked around, heart pounding. The boy ran to his sister, holding her tight as she cried into his coat. Liana stood, arms still outstretched, as if expecting something else to come. But nothing did. Just the wind swirling ashes from the campfire into the sky. An hour passed, then 2. Sheriff Monroe arrived with 3 deputies. He stepped down from his horse and surveyed the scene. 2 dead men, 1 wagon, and a girl saved. "What happened here?" he asked. Elijah didn't blink. "Justice." Monroe nodded. No further questions, no threats. Just a tired man tipping his hat to something he couldn't name. Maybe mercy, maybe something older. That night, the girl and her brother slept in June's old bed, the bed Elijah had refused to touch for years. Liana sat by the fire, her shawl now folded over a chair. Elijah stirred a pot of stew that no one would eat. The air inside the cabin was thick with something too quiet for words, not grief, not relief, something between. Liana didn't look at him when she spoke. "You didn't let them take me. You didn't ask me to." "I would have stayed," she said after a long silence. "If you'd asked." He turned then. His face wasn't stern. It was open, worn, honest. "I didn't know how. You didn't have to. I knew." She reached for his hand, not to hold it, just to touch it. Her fingers brushed his like they were checking to see if he was still real. "Do you think ashes remember the shape of fire?" she whispered. "I think they wait for it," he said. The fire in the hearth popped, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind, once screaming, had grown tired. Inside, something stirred that hadn't lived in that cabin for years. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The memory. The quiet defiance of two souls who'd seen the worst of the world and chose still to stand for something good. They didn't name it, didn't need to. Some truths were stronger without words, and that Elijah thought was how redemption began not with a shout, but with the silence that follows when all the noise has burned away. He watched the children sleep that night. Liana sat beside them, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't sing, she didn't speak, but her presence was its own lullaby. It said, "You're safe. For now. For as long as I can make it so." Elijah leaned against the doorframe, his shotgun resting by his leg. He stared into the night, waiting for the next sound, but there was nothing. Just snow, falling soft as breath. Just peace for now, and the knowledge that tomorrow might bring fire again. But tonight there was quiet, and that was enough. Spring arrived not with a song, but with a whisper. It did not flood the valley with color or the air with the chatter of birds. It came slowly, respectfully, as if unsure whether it was welcome in a place that had carried so much winter. The snow that once blanketed the roof of Elijah Braxton's cabin now slid down in long, reluctant sheets, revealing the wood beneath like old skin finally exposed to sun. Inside, the world had already begun to change. The silence that once haunted the rooms had softened. Where grief once echoed, there now lingered a warmth not born of firewood alone. Liana moved without her cane, her steps light but sure. The cane itself stood untouched in the corner, not discarded, but honored a sentinel of her survival. Every small sound within the cabin now meant something: the rustle of her shawl, the clink of 2 mugs in the morning, the occasional hum of a half-forgotten lullaby she sang when she thought Elijah wasn't listening. The children, those 2 trembling souls rescued from the jaws of cruelty, had stayed with them for a week. In that short span, they had helped plant the earliest seeds of something like healing. When the sheriff's deputy finally arrived to bring them back to town, he offered no questions, only a steady glance between Elijah and Liana. He saw the girl's coat mended by Liana's careful hands, the boy's boots oiled by Elijah. He nodded once, solemn, like someone closing the door on an old sorrow. After they left, the cabin did not feel empty. It felt aware. As if the walls had grown ears, the floorboards carried memory, the hearth knew warmth in more ways than one. Elijah built a second rocking chair. He didn't say a word about it, just left it there on the porch. The next morning, Liana found it sat down with a bundle of sage in her lap and began tying knots of string around the stems, murmuring softly in her native tongue. Elijah watched her from the doorway, heart heavier and lighter all at once. They began tending the land, not for survival, but for the promise of something more. Liana planted onions in a line so straight it would have made a surveyor proud. Then came thyme mint feverfew. Elijah helped with clumsy hands better suited for saddle straps and trigger guards, but he learned. She showed him how to tuck seeds into earth with reverence. This land, she told him, wants to remember what's good. They spoke little, but when they did, it was with intent. She taught him to steep willow bark for pain, to boil pine needles when the air turned thick with cough. He taught her to read the wind's voice across the treetops, to smell snow before it came. They learned not just from each other, but with each other, day by day, wound by wound. One evening, as they watched twilight bleed across the sky from the window, Liana whispered, "I used to think healing meant forgetting." Elijah didn't respond right away. He understood the weight behind such words. Finally, he said, "I used to think peace was silence. Now, I think it's someone sitting beside you when the silence comes." She turned, reached out, and placed her hand over his. She didn't speak again. She didn't have to. Days passed. Notches were carved on the doorframe, not for survival, but for sharing. Not for how many days they endured, but for how many they truly lived. Liana began singing more. Not songs of mourning, but songs of rhythm, sweeping, chopping, cleaning, cooking. Elijah read aloud some nights from an old book she had found under the floorboards. Neither of them understood every word, but that didn't matter. The sound of his voice filled the space between heartbeats. Then, one morning, Liana was gone. The cabin was not in disarray. The fire still crackled a pan of soaked beans on the counter, but her shawl was missing. So was her pouch of herbs. Elijah stood for a long time at the door, one hand still wrapped around a bundle of kindling. Then he moved. He followed the signs with ease. Her steps were careful, but not hidden. A pine needle crushed here, a branch moved just so. He found her near the ridgeline, sitting on a downed log, facing the horizon. Her braid had come undone. The wind lifted strands of hair like prayer flags. "I thought you'd gone west," he said. I walked toward what I feared, she replied, not away. He tied the horse to a birch and sat beside her. No judgment, no urgency. "I needed to know if I was still the woman who was cast out," she continued, "or if the part of me that gave mercy could still survive the weight of being punished for it." Elijah looked down at his hands. "I carried June through snow, thinking love could outrun death. It couldn't. I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter than the wind. "I thought I had more time. Time doesn't care what we believe." They sat until the sun tilted low in the sky. Then he said, "I would have asked you to stay, but I didn't know if I had the right." "You didn't have to ask," she said. "I stayed anyway." They rode back to the cabin together. At the edge of the clearing, Elijah saw something that made him stop. A rabbit nibbling near the porch. Unbothered. Alive. That night they didn't eat much. The fire burned low steady. The second lantern lit the walls in amber. Elijah took Liana's hand as they sat, and this time he didn't let go. Outside, frost edged the windows like lace. Inside, something ancient settled in their bones, not passion, not even joy, but a peace so deep it felt like an inheritance. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, had become a sanctuary, a place where the past was honored, not relived, where grief had made room for gentleness. Liana curled beside him as the lantern flickered low. She asked, "Do you think old wounds remember the pain?" Elijah pressed his lips to her temple. "I think they remember the hands that healed them more." In the quiet that followed, neither of them slept, not out of fear, but reverence. For the first time in years, they weren't waiting for something to end. They were simply living what had finally begun. And somewhere deep beneath the thawing earth, seeds stirred, answering the promise whispered by roots, "You can grow again even here." The story of Elijah Braxton and Liana isn't just a tale of survival. It's a chronicle of rebirth, trust, and the quiet resilience that only those who have truly known pain can carry. From the cold winds of Yellowstone's winter to the whispering promise of a warming spring, what began as a harsh tale of isolation turned into a deeply human journey, where grief found grace and strangers built sanctuary. Elijah, once a man, adrift in sorrow after the death of his beloved June, had become the embodiment of quiet fortitude. His grief had turned his cabin into a shrine of silence, a place where love was frozen in memory and time stood still. And yet, through the act of offering mercy to a wounded stranger, Liana, he unknowingly began the long, hesitant thaw of his own heart. Liana, cast out by her own people for choosing compassion over loyalty, carried her own wounds. Betrayed for saving a settler's child, she wandered not just through snow, but through a personal blizzard of doubt and shame. When Elijah lifted her from the cold, she wasn't just near death, she was lost within it. Yet his silent care, the steadiness of his hands, the warmth of his fire, offered something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. Together they forged a fragile bond, one stitched together not by grand declarations or sudden passion, but by simple shared rituals, stirring soup, tending wounds, sharing silence. It was in these acts that their connection deepened, and with it, the cabin slowly transformed from a refuge of ghosts to a home of purpose. They stood firm against a world that wished to cast her out again. When the townsfolk came with their torches wielding fear and suspicion, it was Elijah who stood without raising his gun, because sometimes the loudest resistance is a man refusing to step aside. And it was Liana who spoke truth into the cold night air, reminding them all that mercy does not make a traitor, it reveals strength. Their courage extended beyond their own salvation. When a boy came crying for help, desperate to save his sister from a group of men who would do her harm, neither hesitated. They rode together side by side, not because they were warriors, but because they were whole again. They faced down violence with steady hands and sheer hearts, and in doing so saved more than just 2 lives, they saved their own legacy. Back in the cabin, the seasons changed, but so did they. Elijah no longer lit the fire for warmth alone, but for the comfort it gave when shared. Liana didn't hum, just to remember she sang to celebrate. The past remained with them, but it no longer defined them. It informed their choices, reminded them of the weight of mercy, the power of gentleness. So, what can we the listeners take from their story? First, we learn that grief is not the end of love. It's the shape it takes when we carry what's lost. Elijah's journey reminds us that while love can't outrun death, it can live on in how we choose to honor the past by continuing to offer warmth even when it hurts to do so. Second, we understand that mercy is courage in its rawest form. Liana chose to heal instead of harm. She saved a life knowing it would cost her everything. Her compassion was misread as betrayal, but in truth it was the purest form of strength. In a world eager to judge, mercy becomes the most radical act. Third, we're reminded that healing is not forgetting, it's remembering differently. Neither Elijah nor Liana erased what they had endured. Instead, they allowed it to shape them with more grace. They didn't build walls, they built chairs. Rocking chairs on the porch. Places to rest, to witness life returning. And finally, we see that home is not where you are born, but where you are seen. The cabin in Yellowstone did not become a sanctuary because it was warm or safe. It became one because 2 people chose to see each other, not for their mistakes, but for their humanity. They didn't rescue each other. They simply chose to stay. In today's world, we often rush past what matters. We numb pain. We judge quickly. We isolate when we should reach out. Elijah and Liana remind us that the most powerful choices are often the quietest ones, lifting someone from the snow, lighting a second lantern, planting onions in frozen soil. So, if this story has moved you, if you found yourself pausing to breathe deeper, remembering your own storms, your own thaw, let it stay with you. Let it be a small fire in your chest the next time you feel cold. And if you believe in stories like this, if you want to hear more about resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength of ordinary people, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support doesn't just keep the fire burning. It tells us these stories still matter, that in a noisy world there is still space for something gentle. Thank you for walking through this winter with us. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and remember even the oldest wounds, remember the hands that healed them.